the Sixers came out and said, hey, together we'll build, trust the process. A lot of baseball teams kind of tanked, but never really said much about it. Was it because people just didn't know what they were doing, where they didn't catch on to them, or was it more blatant and we just weren't paying attention?
Well, I mean, there's very fundamental differences between the NBA and Major League Baseball, obviously, in regards to this. The main difference is that in the NBA, one great draft pick, one overall number one pick can change the fortunes of a franchise overnight, and we've seen it happen. I think, the NBA had to resort to the lottery in order to stop that, and it hasn't stopped it completely, obviously. But in baseball, because it's such a crapshoot with the draft, what you have to do is stockpile. You have to do it through numbers. You have to amass, dozens of prospects and draft picks in order to do this process, and it winds up taking 3, 4, even 5 years to do it. The best example, obviously, is the Astros, who averaged something like 104 losses over 3 years, but built up their franchise through numbers, and they whiffed on some of their draft picks as well, but they did it through numbers, and then they win the World Series last year. So there's very different situations in the NBA and baseball.
Yeah, you brought up the Astros, and they're very parallel with Philadelphia, with the Sixers. They lost over 100 games 3 years in a row. The Sixers were 18, 19, and 10. They then went from 10 to 28. The Astros went from like a 52-win team to a 70-win team. Not great, but not 50. And then they went from 70 into 86. That was the Sixers going from 28 to 52. It seems that the Astros were on this 3-year, into the abyss, and then they jumped right over the middle ground. And that's what a lot of these baseball teams, it seems like, are trying to do. They're trying to jump away from the 75, 80-win team right up into that 90, 100-win.
Well, I mean, I think it's similar to the NBA in that they found that, the smart people realized that the worst thing you could do is just occupy that middle territory year after year after year and just, win 81 games, finish 500, never advance, and spend a lot of money to do it. And so, the smarter thing to do is, if you're not going to be really, really good, you ought to be really, really bad. Strip it down to bare bones, work on developing prospects, hoarding draft picks, and building up through the minor leagues. And, it has a track record of success. I mean, the Washington Nationals had the number one overall draft pick in back-to-back years, and they wound up with Steven Strasburg and Bryce Harper. And then, they haven't won a World Series, but they won the division almost every year since. The Astros, the Cubs are another great example. Tore it down when Theo Epstein got there, lost 100 games, lost 90-something another year, and then slowly built it into a World Series winner in 2016.
Dave Shein's with us from the Washington Post, writing about what's going on in baseball right now. You write about there's a lot of haves and have-nots. You got a bunch of teams on pace for over 100 losses. The attendance is down. Some people would argue with different reasons. Is it because there's so many bad teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, baseball, look, the number one thing, the caveat here is that the weather was terrible in April and into May on the East Coast of the country, as you know. Obviously, that's not a problem the NBA ever has to face. But I don't think it's only the weather, and I think that baseball people, are concerned that the attendance has not bounced back as much as they thought it would in the nicer weather here we've had lately. It's not just the tanking, I think. I think baseball has problems with the style of play on the field. The game is very much reliant upon home runs and strikeouts as pitchers, and the ball is in play less than ever. There's fewer singles. This could be the first season in Major League history that has more strikeouts than hits. The parade of relief pitchers that starts in the fifth inning and slows down the game considerably is out of control. So there's things about what's going on the field that's a problem, but I do think that the tanking is hurting the game. I mean, you look at the cities where the tanking is going on and the attendance is bottoming out. The problem becomes when you go from 2 or 3 teams that are doing it at a time, which is fine and somewhat understandable, but to a point now where you have something like 8 to 10 teams that are tanking, and that's where you run into problems, and that's where you wind up with this extreme stratification like the game has never seen, with a handful of super teams that are on pace for 110 wins and a handful of bottom feeders that are on pace for 110 losses. And so that's where you get a problem.
Yeah, Dave, that's what I was going to ask you. Is it also maybe because there isn't that many compelling races? I mean, it looks like the American League, you could basically pick all the teams right now who are going to be in the playoffs.
Right, just about. I mean, the Astros are sitting at about 100% playoff odds, according to FanGraphs projections. The Yankees and Red Sox are both right around 99.8 or something like that. The Mariners are something like 72%. So thank God for the one-game wild card game, or else there'd be nothing left to play for in the American League. The loser of the Yankees-Red Sox division race has to play a one-game wild card game against somebody like James Paxton of the Mariners. And that's something no team wants to face. So there's motive and incentive there to go for that division title in the AL East. Otherwise, the American League, the entire league, would be essentially devoid of races.
Yeah, I think you just said something there. James Paxton, nobody wants to face him. That might be a problem that not a lot of people even know who that is.
Well, we could get into a whole other discussion about how baseball does a terrible job of marketing its stars. I mean, you guys know all about Mike Trout. I mean, the greatest baseball player of his generation, if not all time. And I bet you he could walk through the streets of my city, Washington, and barely be recognized. I mean, that's a whole other issue.
He's a tough one to pick, too, Dave, because I've never met somebody that could hide in plain sight better than Mike Trout. You know, he goes to an Eagles game, puts on a Carson Wentz jersey, and puts his hoodie up, and you have no idea that he's there.
Right. Well, I mean, it's hard to blame a guy who wants to be private, who doesn't want to be recognized in public that much. But, baseball sure could use a guy like him to be their, Reggie Jackson or somebody like that who relished the spotlight.
When we were emailing back and forth to have you on here, I asked you, so where did this start? Was it the Sixers? Was it the Astros or the Cubs? And you said maybe the Nationals, and then you threw like the Houston Rockets back in the 80s who got Akeem Olajuwon and Ralph Sampson. A lot of people don't mention that, but you mentioned the Nationals, and I don't know that people like today would just readily say, oh, the Nationals tanked. That's how they got these guys. Like, it just seemed like we weren't aware of what was going on, and like the Nationals didn't come out and say, hey, we're going to be bad purposely because we know we can get these level of players. Because in baseball, people would argue that, and like you said, the draft is not going to definitively help you. But these teams today think they know more than the teams did back then, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's become much more of a science than it ever was before. And, in the case of the Nats, I mean, I don't know that people even at the time were recognizing that this was a form of tanking. But, they did know who was coming down the pike in the draft, and they knew that Strasburg was going to be arguably, the greatest pitching prospect in the draft of his generation, and then Harper the next year, the best hitting prospect of his generation. And they knew those guys were coming, and they were going to be, number one picks. And there was some, I would say, examination of the way the team played down the stretch. One of those years, I remember the Nats got the pick on the last day of the season when the Padres, I believe, won a game 162, that pushed the Nats down to the worst record in the league or in the game, and that's how they got that pick. So, yeah, there's a long history here. I mean, the Rockets are a great example. They definitely tanked down the stretch in 83, 84. I think they went something like 7-29 in their last 36 games to get the number one overall pick. And the funny thing is they passed on Michael Jordan and picked Olajuwon.
Yeah, Dave, you had that article up previous, too, about it's no longer a dirty little secret that tanking is on full display. Do you think then that fans, because you talked about people didn't recognize the Nationals tanking, do you think that fans today are now more cognizant of that it's taking place, aware of it?
Yeah, that's the thing. You know, on an individual team basis, I think it makes perfect sense for teams to tank. I think fans are sophisticated. They recognize that this is an established and successful way to build a champion. They've seen it happen with the Cubs, the Astros, and on and on. And I think on an individual team level, it's acceptable now. But you get into a problem, like I said, when you have 10 teams doing it, a third of the game. That's when you're going to run into the problems like we're seeing right now. And I don't know, how you go about stopping.
I thought your hockey anecdote was hilarious too when you brought up the fact that Buffalo Sabres fans once cheered their team losing, like a goal against, because that's how much they wanted to get the top draft pick that year that Connor McDavid was available.
Right, and that's the thing. Fans understand it. Sophisticated fans completely get this. I mean, just a couple of winters ago, the Chicago White Sox traded away guys like Chris Sale, and Adam Eaton, and their fans were cheering it. I mean, everybody seemed to be behind it. It was, oh great, let's tear this thing down and lose 100 games. So it's flipped to the point where fans are completely on board, and that's great for those franchises. But the rest of the game suffers.
There's no question. I was a proponent of what the Sixers were doing because it was in the rules. But as you said, there's got to be a way that you can incentivize losing. And I think in basketball, you mentioned it. You get that one player, he can turn the whole thing around pretty quickly. In baseball, I don't think that is recognized nearly as much. But as you write, it does seem to be more prevalent now. And whether you want to say that that's the most prevalent reason for the attendance problems or what's going on with the game, it certainly has a place in why this game is suffering right now. It's a lot of bad baseball.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, who in their right mind in August is going to pay money to go see Kansas City and Baltimore, or Kansas City and the White Sox in August? I mean, the attendance right now is down something like 6 to 7% over last year at the same date, and baseball hasn't seen a drop off in attendance like that since the player strike of 94-95. So I mean, that should tell you all you need to know about how damaging this is potentially to the game.
You mentioned the Nationals, the Cubs, the Astros, but do you think in general that tanking is working?
Well, it's certainly not a slam dunk. I mean, it has to be done right. I mean, and in fact, with the Cubs and Astros, you're talking about two of the smartest front offices in the game in terms of, not only just brain power, but we're talking like analytics, deep analytics, and just smart management. So I wouldn't trust a front office like the Baltimore Orioles or something like that to do this the right way and to tear it down. I was the Orioles beat writer actually in 2001, I think it was, when they traded 6 or 7 veteran players. They had a fire sale at midseason, and they wound up with nothing. I mean, they basically ended up getting Melvin Mora and a bag of baseballs for guys like, B.J. Surhoff and Charles Johnson and Will Clark, and great players. So in the hands of the wrong people, it can be a disaster. But I think that baseball's been emboldened by the examples of the Cubs and the Astros.
Yeah, because you have a system now of haves and have-nots. You're either a 100-win team or you're a 100-loss team, and that is also carrying over to the offseason, Dave. I mean, you saw this year, nobody wanted to sign free agents.
Well, right. That's what happens, and that's what got the union up in arms, rightly so, was you've got 10 teams sitting out the free agency, and that means a lot of guys are going to have to wait deep into the spring, take offers that they would not have expected to have to accept, or to not sign at all. Some free agents never got signed and are essentially forced into retirement. So that's where you saw the union complaining, and you saw Scott Boras making some pretty incendiary remarks, and so that completely was fueled by the tanking.
Dave, what's Rob Manfred's position been on tanking, and if he's against it, then how can he fix it?
Well, he said as recently as February, I remember, that it wasn't a problem. It was not as widespread as people thought, and it's cyclical, and that there's examples of the Cubs and the Astros, and he essentially defended it. He has sort of been.
Did he think the Cubs and the Astros tanked?
He didn't use that term. I mean, they certainly reject that term. I mean, they say rebuilding, which is, I guess, somewhat of a euphemism or whatever. But no, he does not use the word tanking. Baseball executives completely shun that word.
You just mentioned Baltimore. I mean, you're down there in that Beltway area. Dave Sheehan's with us from the Washington Post. You said you covered the Orioles. They're 23-54. They're winning 29% of their games. Are they tanking, or are they just bad? Is there a fine line between it?
They're just bad. No, not in this case. I mean, they tried. God help them, which only makes it worse. To be this bad. They spent money this winter. They spent 50, 60, maybe $70 million on starting pitching to sign guys like Alex Cobb and Andrew Kashner, and they put money in the product thinking they could contend again. And they did, they've done well in this era, the Buck Showalter, Dan Duquette era. They went to the playoffs in 2012, 2014, and 2016. So I mean, it's not like they're a moribund franchise, but they tried and they failed miserably. But they're also bringing the product down on the field.
The whole middle ground thing. See, in basketball, I do agree. If you're stuck in that middle purgatory, you ain't getting out of there. I mean, there's very, very few teams that are the 8 seed, 7 seed, 6 seed, and work their way up the food chain. They're always stuck as the 8, the 7, the 6. The very few teams go from 8 to 2 to championship level. But in baseball, do you buy that being stuck in the middle is purgatory?
Well, it can be. It certainly can be. You run the risk of never getting over the hump. Just because smarter teams or teams that are more willing to tank like this are constantly restocking and surging past you. So, I don't want to say the middle class is extinct in baseball. It's certainly not, but it seems to be kind of shrinking.